Hi friends, welcome to the Eastern Front channel. Today we will talk about the memoirs of Friedrich Paulus adjutant Wilhelm Pieck. He fought with Paulus until he was captured in 1943. Let's try together to understand the reasons for the defeat of Paulus' army in Stalingrad. We then turn to questions about the Second World War. I had once honestly believed in Hitler's plan for a new order in Europe. Absolutely convinced by it, I had gone into France to resolve the insult of Versailles. Equally honestly had I gone into the Eastern campaign, albeit with some inner unease, because the Soviet Union appeared to me to be a power with so much unknown about it. I first had serious doubts about it in the cauldron on the Volga. Nevertheless, my doubts hardly touched the question of whether the war was correct or incorrect, but rather formed a criticism of Hitler's strategic concept not just of a two-front war, but in arousing the hostility of almost the whole world. I was now able to follow the vocabulary of preventative war. But I had never believed it so correct, and in the last minutes I had become convinced that it was only needed by Hitler as a propaganda tool in order to justify the breach of the agreement and give the war against Soviet Russia a moral appearance. As I had undertaken to listen to my interlocutors' arguments, and not to squash them with my know-it-all attitude, I kept quiet. Arnold, taking my silence as unspoken contradiction, then continued after a short pause more sharply than before. With your interest in historical questions, you have surely read Hitler's Mein Kampf. Remember the place where he said, "We stop the German march to the south and go over to ground policy in the east." In more accurate German that means, we will rob the Slav peoples of their territory and their natural treasures and turn them into our working animals. Look at the tirades of hatred and views that were delivered against Bolshevism at the Nuremberg party days. Think of the practice of plundering and especially the mishandling of people that during your membership of the German Eastern Army you cannot have missed. Or remember Goebbels' speech in the summer of 1942, in which the Reich's propaganda minister proclaimed the robber character of the war, when he spoke of the lining of pockets, but he was not speaking of some ideal or other, but rather of wheat, coal, ores, and oil. Remember, Colonel Adam? Yes, I remembered. I also wanted to admit it. But then everything we had striven for and believed in, and for which we had been ready to put our lives at stake in this stream of blood and tears, would become evil and false. I wanted to talk to Professor Arnold about these doubts, but Schmidt then entered the room. He must have heard the last words and immediately joined in the talk. As formerly so often in the cauldron, even now he wanted to dominate the course of the conversation. In his arrogance, he lost all proportion in his performance and was on the verge of insulting the Soviet professor. Arnold smiled, sucked in his cheeks, rose, nodded slightly at Schmidt, and left the room. I escorted him to the door of the block and apologized for the unwelcome incident. We parted with a hearty handshake. Unfortunately, there were no more chats with Professor Arnold as soon afterwards he left Sustal. He had helped me take the first steps on the stony, difficult path to new shores by giving me valuable assistance in opening up new problems, understanding and feeling for certain ways, but ripping up false trails. Schmidt's entrance had made me realize that the clarification process would be associated with conflicts in our own ranks. Obviously, it would lead firstly to a dispute among the Germans themselves. Even the older ones in the order of rank known to me for decades, from the highest commander or highest warlord, from the field marshals, generals, staff officers, captains and lieutenants down to the lowest soldier, all was up for discussion, by rank, authority, and obedience to duty precisely classified. It did not apply to the position within the military hierarchy. The question was what goals the individual objectives serve. Was each man just a tool, the foil of an unjust, immoral war of conquest? Did he remain a staunch follower of a leadership that did not hesitate to commit crimes, or did he say away with it and go against it? From these questions arose the separation between fascists and anti-fascists, which the experiences of the Krasnogorsk camp and Susdal, and also from leaflets of various propaganda works in the camp library, had not rendered so intelligible. Accordingly, I then thought, Schmidt's behavior was that of a fascist. Where then did I, Wilhelm Pieck, fit in, who had been promoted to colonel by Hitler and decorated with the Knight's Cross? These questions remained. Months went by before I finally cleared them up. One day in 1943, Colonel Novikov announced through an interpreter that there were some Germans come to visit the field marshal. Hardly had I informed Paulus when the camp commandant and the interpreter were already on the steps of our accommodation. In their company was an old man with white hair. With the words, "This is Herr Wilhelm Pieck, who wants to talk to you, Field Marshal," the colonel introduced the visitor. Wilhelm Pieck supplemented this. He was a member of the German Reichstag and wanted to speak to Paulus about the fate of the German people. As I was about to excuse myself, he smilingly waved me down. "Stay here. What I have to say to you, you should quietly listen to. It concerns you too." With a certain reticence, Paulus invited his visitor to sit down at the table near the window. I sat down to the side with Novikov and the interpreter. This then was the communist Wilhelm Pieck. I had never seen him before. Only faintly could I remember his name from the time before 1933. He had a worthy enough appearance, I thought, as I looked on. Goodness and understanding came from his eyes. What would he make of Paulus? The field marshal looked at him silently. Apparently he wanted to offer the visitor no bridge to a conversation, but rather wait. Wilhelm Pieck then opened the conversation. "I wanted to ask about you, Field Marshal. Apparently you were surprised that I, a communist, who must have emigrated from the homeland, should come to you. But I really need to talk to you." This sounded so natural, so sincere, that Paula's voice took on a warmer tone. "I thank you for your interest, Herr Pieck. As you can see, I am well accommodated. My health has considerably improved in the last weeks. Colonel Novikov looks after us. We have German and Russian doctors. The food is good and sufficient. One could not expect more as a prisoner of war. You, Field Marshal, and many other Germans would have been spared imprisonment if you had not let Hitler and his team lead you," retorted the visitor. "You can see, Herr Pieck, that I am a soldier. As a soldier, I have to fulfill the orders of my superiors. I have never concerned myself with the political aspects. Field Marshal, you are a clever and well-educated officer. You must have known that Hitler had led our people astray and betrayed them. Or do you really think that the Soviet Union wanted to conquer Germany?" Paulus appeared to be getting excited. "I cannot imagine, Herr Pieck, that a head of state could betray his people and his army. Like millions of others, I believed Hitler's words when the General Staff was tasked with the preparation of the attack plans against the Soviet Union. I also had faith in the High Command when the catastrophe of Stalingrad was already well underway." This admission of disillusioned trust had not come easily from Paulus. I could see in his face how it affected him. Wilhelm Pieck was also lively. "You were the army commander, Field Marshal. Your military career and position gave you a deep insight into war matters, into Hitler's methods of leadership and his war aims. You must have already thought about the critical development. The lives of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were entrusted to you. Why did you fight on for so long at the Volga in a hopeless cause? Why did you believe Hitler's lies more than your conscience and your judgment? Why did you dismiss the Red Army's honorable surrender offer? Hitler is a criminal who never represented the interests of our nation. We communists recognized this from the very first and told the people. You and your generals also recognized it at the last in the Stalingrad cauldron and consequently had to deal with it, Field Marshal." Paulus replied dismissively, "I have already said once, Herr Pieck, that we soldiers never concerned ourselves with politics. We dared not involve ourselves. Our basic principle is that the German soldier must not be political. I have remained faithful to this motto. Hitler was for us not just the head of state, he was also the commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht, with whose orders we have to comply unconditionally. I did not know the plans and possibilities of the Army High Command outside the cauldron. That is why I could not simply give in." The conversation had come dramatically to a head. Two men who were diametrically opposed to each other were sitting at the table. The Field Marshal, a simple non-political soldier, for whom blind obedience to the orders of the superior was his ethos, and there the communist workers' leader, whose dealings regarding spiritual sovereignty and the highest responsibility were certainly to the people. Wilhelm Pieck did not let go. "So, almost all officers maintain, like you, Field Marshal, that they have become non-political and want to continue being so. What does non-political mean then? Do you not realize that you have played a not insignificant role in politics? Unfortunately, a role of a negative nature. You were pliant tools in the hands of the spoilers of our people, whose goals were the exact opposites of our national and socialistic ones. War of conquest, war of exploitation was their goal. And you, the generals and officers of the Wehrmacht, have obediently served their criminal policies. In a clear, unpolished way, the chairman of the German Communist Party showed that we had done some very damaging things for our people. In the end, we had become Hitler's pacemakers and made ourselves equally responsible for all the wrongs, damage, and suffering that other peoples had experienced through Hitler's war. Regretfully, he continued, as already in 1914 to 1918, so in this war, our gifted industrial German people, our working people, above all the workers and farmers, have to pay the bill. Consider for once in whose interest this war has been conducted. Think of the Sixth Army's catastrophe. You have to go way back in history to find such an example of our people's misery and misfortune. Believe me, the whole of Germany's picking a war is a crime. It serves a handful of German monopolists and militarists, who out of the blood and bones of the German soldiers, and out of the distress of the conquered peoples, have made vast profits. Should a few marks fall to the population or to the soldiers, they are but tiny proportions of the stolen profit, mere pence for the participants. My party had warned even before 1933. Hitler is war. Unfortunately, we were unable to prevent the fascists taking power and the disaster they caused. We can and must avoid plunging the German people into a national catastrophe. That is why we communists are fighting together with all those who hate the fascist criminals and love the German people. Wilhelm Pieck then expressed the wish to speak to Paulus alone. Later I learned from Paulus that the chairman of the German Communist Party had developed plans for the founding and leading of a national German committee that would conduct the fight against the Hitler regime on the widest front, and for the speedy ending of the war. Emigrant workers, leaders, and writers would work closely together with officer and soldier prisoners of war. All differences of opinion would have to be withheld in the interests of the German nation. To the fore must come not the divisive elements, but rather the unifying aspects in view of Hitler's conjured up immense threat to the existence of the German people. They both, the communist and the field marshal, were German. The history of their homeland moved them both deeply. If they united, Hitler must fall into their hands. Pieck called on Paulus to openly turn against Hitler and to cooperate on the planned committee. The field marshal was as horrified of the consequences as I was when I heard this. Pieck's proposal seemed unheard of at that time, and we wanted nothing to do with it. On the other hand, we had to agree with the communists in their assessment of the situation and the nature of the war. Above all, Pieck's personality influenced us, as did the simplicity and convincing power of his speech and his glowing patriotism. This was no landless fellow, as the Nazis would say, and he stayed in our imagination and even haunted us. Looking back at these days in June 1943, I would like to say that Paulus and I appear to get a strong impulse for our own understanding as a result of our talks with Wilhelm Pieck. The talk stimulated us to cross over from the traditional area of military thought, the officer's oath and military discipline, to examine the question according to its political aspects. For the first time it opened our eyes clearly to the importance of active resistance to Hitler and the pursuit of the war. Pieck stayed in Suzzal for more than a week. He and his escorting poet, Johannes R. Becker, had numerous conversations with generals and officers, among them von Seydlitz, Latman, Korfs, and von Lenski. At a full assembly of the camp's prisoners of war, but which the generals did not attend, Pieck asserted that the war was no longer able to be won by Germany. The Allies were also not thinking of seeking peace with Hitler. Thus, there was only one way of saving Germany, overthrowing Hitler and ending the war immediately. This was what the Communist Party was fighting for, but they were not alone. They called upon all honorable Germans at home, at the front and in captivity, to conduct this war with them. There should be no political, ideological, or professional differences to hamper the vital chance to unite all the opponents of Hitler. Only a few of the prisoners of war at Suzzal camp approved of such speeches and talks at that time. The later development showed, however, that the German Communist Party's solution provided a real alternative to the catastrophic policy of Hitler's regime. The Communists grasped the decisive initiative to form a German anti-fascist fighting front. The seeds that were planted in July 1943 among the prisoner of war officers and generals would at least soon germinate and in some instances come to fruition. Our stay in Sussex was about as long as the one at Krasnogorsk. After 2 months or so, at the beginning of July 1943, the order came again, generals to make ready for the transport. Towards evening, Colonel Novikov came to say goodbye to us. Provided with supplies, we climbed into our bus, happy to be outside the barbed wire again. A car was ready for Field Marshal Paulus. After a journey of several hours through a light, mild summer night, we came to a camp gate for the third time in the first 6 months of our imprisonment. We had arrived at Volkovo, the prisoner of war camp for generals. The camp commandant was an old colonel who spoke German. Unfortunately, I have forgotten his name. His deputy was a quite young lieutenant colonel named Pusyrov. The camp doctor was Dr. Morov. The nucleus of the camp was formed by a large former farmhouse built of stone. Opposite lay a second building, whose ground floor was also of stone, and a single-story administrative building. The finest thing was the laid-out park with an old stand of trees and a linden alley, which went right through the park and past the living accommodation that had until recently served as a nursing home for the Ivanovo railway workers. As in Sustal, there were here at first 31 generals in the camp, 22 German, 6 Romanian, and 3 Italian. Together with Field Marshal Paulus, I occupied 2 rooms, while for the generals there were single, double, and several bedded rooms. I was pleased with the well-set-up dining room and lounge. There was also a well-kept library here. Several generals had given up their rejection of political books and others had started thinking about it. Even if unanimity was displayed to the outside, the increasing schism in the generals' front could not remain concealed. There were divided opinions about Germany's war aims, about the National Socialist German Workers' Party, and about the Soviet Union. 3 groups formed in the first weeks after our arrival in Volkovo. To the first group belonged the generals who were looking for new ways forward and were considering how to turn the German people away from Hitler's catastrophic operational policy. The most advanced of these were Latman and Darkhorst. The second group had inwardly turned away from Hitler and his system, but they were dithering, had many reservations, and saw no new way ahead. Among this group at that time I would like to count von Seydlitz, von Lenski, Wolz, and myself. To the third group belonged those who obstinately clung to the old ways. They were led by Generals Heitz, Rodenburg, Schmidt, and 6 von Arnim. They represented the point of view that as long as we remained together, we would ensure that everyone stuck to it. Finally, there were some generals whose behavior was difficult to identify. They mainly held back from the discussions. Field Marshal Paulus tried to keep out of all the discussions. He wanted to smooth down the ever more frequent high waves. During the first days after our arrival in Volkovo, Schmidt was transferred to another camp. This was regretted by the Heitz, Rodenburg, and 6 von Arnim group. Apart from Rodenburg, Schmidt had no real friends among the generals. Consequently, his departure did not affect those remaining much. A labor company belonged to the generals' camp, as Volkovo was called, consisting of 1/3 each of German, Romanian, and Italian prisoners of war. They acted as kitchen staff, laborers, and batmen for the generals. Among the German prisoners of war, there was a whole number that had not only turned away from Hitler, but were of the opinion that we should openly oppose Hitler and his war. These soldiers formed the anti-fascist group in the camp. They not only won over the majority of their comrades to their opinion, but especially called on the generals to fight against Hitler and his system. This raised a cloud of dust. How could such soldiers dare speak to generals like that? Above all, Colonel General Heitz raged and complained about these communists, as he called them. But the anti-fascists did not let themselves be intimidated. As workers, farmers, or laborers in soldiers' uniforms, they realized sooner than we did that Hitler's war brought only distress and suffering to the German people, while some fat cats did well out of it. In the middle of July, there was a storm of indignation in our ranks, brought about by a new newspaper in the German language being distributed in the camp. This newspaper was the Freies Deutschland, Free Germany. There it stated in black and white that on the 12th and 13th July 1943 in Krasnogorsk, the National Committee, Freies Deutschland, had been founded by German emigrants, German officer and soldier prisoners of war, and surviving Stalingrad fighters. The few examples of the newspaper that we had received were passed from hand to hand. The main interest was not in the content of the manifest to the Wehrmacht and the German people, but in the names of those that had signed it. Every one of us found the names of officers and soldiers that we knew and that we had once treasured as friends. How could they have done something like this with the communists? That was enough to bring about a damning condemnation of them all. At the same time, it was satisfying that it involved only young officers who had frivolously broken their oaths of allegiance. The first waves of excitement had the generals packing their bags. I was no exception. It appeared as if there was real unanimity in the condemnation of the sheet. Then even the emotional ones calmed down. Several of us began to consider the events more soberly. We studied the contents of the National Committee, Freies Deutschland's manifest to the Wehrmacht and the German people. The deeper I got into it, the more I had to say to myself that the signatories of this appeal had done so out of deep concern and responsibility towards the German people with this extraordinary publication. It continued that Hitler was leading Germany to destruction. It said in the manifest, "No foreign enemy has brought us so much misfortune as Hitler. The facts prove that the war is lost. Germany can only drag on at the cost of inhuman sacrifice and deprivation. The continuance of this pointless war means the end of the nation. But Germany must not die. It is now a question of being or not being our fatherland. If the German people take courage in time and demonstrate by their acts that they want to be a free people and are determined to free Germany of Hitler and win the right to decide about its future fate and its place in the world, that is the only way to save the existence, the freedom, and the honor of the German nation. The German people need and want immediate freedom. But Hitler concludes peace with no one. No one will also deal only with him. That is why the formation of a true German government is our people's most urgent task." Every evening von Lenski, Wolz, Rosk, and I took a walk along the camp road. We discussed the war situation and the National Committee. In our opinion of the war situation, we fully agreed with the manifest and the reports in the Freies Deutschland newspaper. In the half year that had passed since the German defeat on the Volga, Libya and Tunis had been lost, but most of all we had lost the Battle of Kursk. 17 German panzer divisions, reinforced by the 60-ton Tiger tanks and the 70-ton Ferdinand assault guns, attacked along the 70-kilometer front. That was a panzer division every 4 kilometers. Never before had the Wehrmacht concentrated so much attacking strength in such a crowded area. But the German summer offensive of 1943 was beaten back by the Red Army within a few days. In their counter-offensive, the Soviet troops were able to regain the cities of Oryol and Belgorod, and their attack rolled on further to the west. How much longer would it now take before it reached Kharkov or even Kiev? We knew that Germany had no more reserves available that could be set against the enemy armies storming forwards. The manifest was quite correct when it said, "The armies of England and America stand at Europe's door. Soon Germany will have to fight on all sides. The weakened German Wehrmacht, ever more closely surrounded by overwhelming enemies, will not and cannot continue to withstand them. The day of collapse draws near." Dear friends, that's all for today. Please support my channel with any comment. Thanks a lot. It was Tim, and see you.